presentation that I'll give today is based on some research that I did last year that's now been published in Qualitative Research. You can see the DOI below if you're interested in reading more. So here's just a quick overview of what I'll talk about, my background, where the research came from, as well as background to the study in terms of emotions research, as well as emotions and ethics research before I get into the methods findings, and hopefully there's time for implications. So in short, I'm a health sociologist and a scholar of emotions. And I do have experience of sitting on a university-based ethics committee several years ago. So I brought these experiences and expertise to this project. First, the background is based on my understanding of a few kind of review pieces that I've done that are looking within sociology and outside of sociology into neighboring disciplines, just on how much has changed over the past several decades in terms of how we understand emotions. If we go back to historical research, we can see kind of that ancient Greek understanding of what was called pathos may potentially be re-emerging as a kind of relevant concept. We can see within medieval Christianity a very strong suspicion of emotions, especially passionate emotions that weren't associated with religious fervor. And we see an ongoing legacy of mind-body dualism that's attributed to René Descartes. This kind of dualistic understanding of mind and body as separate, reasoning and emotion as separate. So this has been likened to the metaphor of Saxe's fable about blind men and the elephant, all kind of touching the elephant and seeing different things in terms of how we understand emotions. And of course, emphasizing a need to recognize emotions as multiple and complex. In a paper on post-paradigmatic approaches to studying emotions, I've kind of broken this down into 4 different ways of conceptualizing emotions, from very physiological approaches connected with universalist Darwinian understandings of emotion, through to more interactionist approaches similar to Hochschild's concept of emotion management, where we see culture, community as shaping how we understand emotions and what's expected of us in terms of emotional displays. Critical approaches really emphasize how emotions are implicated in processes of subjugation. And affective approaches push us to recognize emotions as not just internal to an individual, but relational and expanding across bodies. So drawing on these theories, and I've kind of summarized all of that here on this slide, I ask these questions: how do research ethics committees regard emotions in light of all these changes to understanding emotions over the past several decades, based in research across not just kind of history and sociology, but also psychology and neuroscience as well? And do national human research ethics guidelines reflect this current scholarship on emotions? Further into this background, we also see that there's been a lot happening in the research on emotions in research. We've seen growing scholarship being critical of principle-based ethics approaches, accusing them of epistemic violence. And I can see, oh good, I'm not frozen anymore, okay. These, of course, are the principles underpinning much of our national human research ethics guidelines and HREC guidelines in Australia. So these types of approaches have been accused of being tick box exercises for imposing Western neoliberal biomedical frameworks on other settings, for overriding decision-making of vulnerable groups, and privileging research and objectivity, and in turn pathologizing participants and researchers' emotions. So in my analysis, I drew on Anne-Marie Moll's very influential work that looks at how it is that we conceptualize choice and care across different philosophical frameworks, but also the important work by Sarah Ahmed and Mary Holmes on affective approaches to thinking about emotions as political and the importance of reflexivity in thinking about emotions. So the research used discursive analysis approaches, prioritizing presupposition, intertextuality, and pronoun use in particular to look at guidelines across 4 different countries. So these are the documents that I sampled from those 4 different English-speaking countries. And my findings can be grouped across these 3 key themes around pro-social emotions, emotions as hazards, and medico-legal conceptualizations. So other than the encouragement to maintain trust, respect, and dignity, the focus in the guidelines is really overwhelmingly on unpleasant emotions that are prioritized as threats to participants' well-being. And reflecting kind of mind-body dualist and medical-legal discourses, emotions are often treated as both necessary to research endeavors, but risky, and as pathologies and threats to decision-making, especially amongst vulnerable participants like pregnant women. So regarding this first finding, upholding trust in scientific processes through transparency was assumed to be a priori good. But we do see some kind of cracks in that assumption in Singapore guidelines, for example, where fostering trust isn't just about the public's interest, it's also about kind of building the nation's kind of economic capacity in this space as well. And of course, trust is necessary. It's really important that people feel some degree of confidence that they can predict the future based on past events so that they can make judgments and proceed. But after trust is established, some research suggests that this is where manipulation can blossom. It can undermine autonomous participant decision-making. Respect was also emphasized as a pro-social emotion within the documents. It implies an understanding of respect as central to doing what's morally right and maintaining social order. And we can trace this use of respect, understanding of it, back to Enlightenment era philosopher Immanuel Kant, who argued that respect is fundamental to moral community building. And Kant's influence is also evidenced in phrasing within guidelines associated with Helsinki Declaration, of course, calling for participants to be treated with dignity and respect rather than as means to an end. So encouragement of these pro-social emotions really signals continued alignment with Kant's Enlightenment era thinking. And these 3 emotions explicitly encouraged within examined guidelines are all what emotion scholars would call moral or pro-social emotions associated with really low-level somatic sensations. The valuation of only these, what might be called rational emotions as well, echoes this kind of mistrust of passionate emotions that we saw within that medieval Christianity period, and also echoing in interpretations of Descartes' work on mind-body dualism. Within Australian guidelines, in particular, this term respect has a specific connotation to the country's history of colonization. So there are really special directions to show respect for First Nation participants, overseas communities, something we heard about in Eleanor's talk recently as well, and respect for cultural difference. And these directives are, of course, important, but the use of the possessive pronoun, their cultural context, and the adjective different values may further an assumption that the researcher and researched are inherently distinct and not from the same community. Next, with the exception of respect, dignity, and trust, cautionary treatment of emotions really dominated. So Singaporean guidelines, for example, conceptualized emotions as a form of harm, synonymous with physical injury, requiring careful review by an HREC. And there's brief acknowledgement that research may improve well-being in US and Australian guidelines, but overall the emphasis is on safeguarding participants' well-being and welfare across the guidelines in all 4 countries where documents were examined. But welfare and well-being are very vague and encompassing terms. So definitions within the guidelines were really rare. But inferred definitions range from things like protecting participants' autonomy and self-interests in Singapore guidelines to holistic understanding of health as opposed to biomedical approaches in UK guidelines to protection from emotional harm in Australian guidelines. So in terms of emotions, especially those visceral emotions imbued with negative affect, these were treated with suspicion, especially in Australian guidelines. US, Singaporean, UK guidelines were comparatively silent regarding these emotions, with the exception of embarrassment in US guidelines. Contemporary research, however, suggests that things like anger, guilt, fear, embarrassment, and anxiety, these are not inherently harmful sensations, and some even position them as very important pro-social emotions that push people to bond together, and even as a motivation for important social change. So in short, by locating emotions like anger, guilt, embarrassment in definitions of psychological harm, the Australian guidelines in particular position these quote unquote negative emotions as fundamentally threatening to health, reinforcing a kind of limited understanding of emotions that really belies the complexity of social life and denies participants some of those benefits of catharsis as well. Third, the guidelines are often kind of dualistic, and this treatment, this dualistic mind-body dualism treatment of emotions reflected the professions of most of the contributing authors, with medicine and law famously being underpinned by mind-body dualist kind of practices, if not theories. Within HREC guidelines, emotions are often treated as irrelevant, risks to be managed, symptoms of pathology, or threats to rational decision-making. These risks, however, aren't shared between researchers and researched. Researcher emotional vulnerability was really rarely acknowledged, and this may have the effect of denying the significance or worse, kind of pathologizing researchers' emotions. And within Australian guidelines in particular, distressing emotions are cast as symptoms of disease, threats to informed consent that can undermine rational decision-making. And Australian guidelines treat pregnant women as vulnerable and ground protectionism in concern for their emotional well-being. But this can be concerning because they infer that women are emotionally affected by pregnancy, compromising their informed decision-making capacity. And as such, if women are too emotional, Australian researchers should override their autonomy by not informing them of relevant research opportunities. And this stands in really sharp contrast to the prioritization of autonomy, within the US Belmont report. So in summary, the guidelines that were analyzed have shifted from really largely overlooking emotions, if we think about the Belmont report from the late 70s, to a very risk-averse pathologization of emotions when we think about the Australian national statement. And the findings suggest that emotional discourses and guidelines tend to pathologize emotions and undermine possible relational benefits of research through adherence to outdated mind-body dualist understandings of emotions and people. And such dualism really reifies gendered ways of seeing and organizing the world and overlooks the centrality of emotions to decision-making, while bolstering an uncritical notion of emotions as hazardous to reasoning that goes against research and common sense. So in the interest of time, I'll just quickly go through some of these kind of implications, the so what. So my suggestions are that we need to acknowledge this complexity, and we need to understand that emotions aren't just kind of relevant as well to those who are vulnerable. We need to acknowledge limitations of principalist-based approaches and the tendency for those approaches to overlook or pathologize emotions. Acknowledge the limitations of principalist approaches because these approaches may undermine autonomy and treat participants as a means to an end for knowledge production. And in terms of guidelines, they should be revised to conceptualize emotions as culturally and socially imbued parts of everyday life, and support a reflexive approach to ethical conduct. So I'll just leave it there and see if there's any time for one question maybe.
If you appreciate qualitative research, you'll appreciate that we've just been treated to an elegantly designed, elegantly carried out qualitative study, very effectively presented, rich in content that is going to take us a long time to contemplate. Thank you, Rebecca. Question?